The sound of the front door closing behind us resonated more than it should have on such a tranquil street. I turned to my husband, looking for an explanation, but all I received was his familiar grin, the one I had seen countless times before. I had assumed we were simply going to enjoy a quiet evening at home. That was the plan when I left work, drained and eager to relax into the weekend. Yet, here I stood, in front of a stranger's house, entirely unaware of why we were there. "Trust me," he murmured, his hand gently resting on my lower back as he guided me toward the door. The house was modest, tucked away in an unfamiliar area of the city, and something about it felt wrong. The porch light flickered feebly, casting just enough illumination to expose the peeling paint on the door. I should have spoken up then, asked him what we were doing here, but for some reason, I remained silent. We had been married for 6 years, long enough to settle into the comforting routine of each other's company, the steady rhythm of everyday life. But recently, something had shifted, a slight distance between us. It was subtle, like a loose thread in the background neither of us wanted to acknowledge. So, when he suggested spending the evening with his friends, I assumed it was his way of trying to bridge that gap. I pushed my doubts aside and stepped inside. The first thing that struck me was the silence. There was no music, no chatter, just the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. 3 men were scattered around the living room, each holding a drink. As I entered, they all turned to face me. I didn't recognize any of them, but the way they looked at me made me feel exposed, like I was under a spotlight, despite the dim lighting. "Hey, you made it," one of them called, stepping toward me. He was tall, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. My husband gave him a brief nod, as if everything was perfectly normal, but I could feel the tension building in my chest. I forced a smile, trying to blend in. "Yeah, we're here." They offered me a drink, which I accepted without thinking, just something to occupy my hands. My husband quickly joined the conversation, laughing with the others about something I didn't quite catch. I stood there, feeling out of place, sipping my drink slowly, wondering why I didn't feel more at ease. Everything about this felt rehearsed. The way my husband moved around the room so casually, so familiar with these men. How they kept glancing at me, but never for too long. Just enough to make me feel like the only one who didn't know what was happening. I wanted to ask him why we were here, why he had dragged me out when all I wanted was to stay home, but the words never came. There was something in the air, subtle but unmistakable, telling me I wouldn't like the answer. So I stayed quiet, watching them laugh, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was wrong. One of the men, the one with the easy smile, moved closer. His eyes lingered on my face a bit too long. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low, but there was something in it that sent a chill through me. I nodded, forcing another smile, but I could feel my heart race. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't move, staying too close for comfort. "It's okay," he said. "You'll feel better soon." Before I could respond, my husband stepped in, clapping a hand on the man's shoulder, pulling him back into their conversation. I exhaled, surprised to realize I had been holding my breath. What was going on? The evening dragged on, each minute feeling longer than the last. I felt trapped, caught between politeness and an instinct I didn't want to admit. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, reading too much into things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a casual hangout. At one point, my husband caught my eye from across the room. For the first time that evening, I saw something in his expression that unsettled me. It wasn't concern or care. It was curiosity, like he was waiting to see how I would react. I swallowed hard, gripping the glass in my hand tighter. A cold shiver ran through me, despite the warmth in the room. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm and distant. I nodded again, but I knew he didn't believe me, and I didn't believe myself. The tension was thick, suffocating. I could feel it in the way the men moved around me, in the way my husband smiled without his eyes ever softening. I should have left then, made up some excuse about not feeling well, anything to escape, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed. The air was heavy with unspoken words, and all I could think was that I had no idea what was going to happen next. The cold from the night outside still clung to the room, despite the warmth of all the bodies around me. I sat on the edge of the couch, pulling my legs up as though trying to shrink into myself. My husband was deep in conversation with one of the men, laughing about something I couldn't quite hear. Everything felt blurry, like I was watching through frosted glass. And then it happened. A moment so subtle, so quiet, that I almost missed it. One of the other men, the one with dark eyes and a gravelly voice, leaned over from the armchair across from me. His hand brushed my arm lightly as he handed me a drink, and before I could even register what had happened, he kissed me on the cheek. It was quick, almost innocent, like something you might expect from an old friend or distant relative you hadn't seen in ages. But it wasn't that. Not even close. My heart skipped, but I forced a smile. I glanced at my husband. Surely he'd seen that. He had to have, but he didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't break his conversation. He acted like nothing had happened, like it was completely normal for his friend to lean in that close to me, to kiss me without warning. That's when I realized this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a casual get-together. This was something planned, something intentional. My stomach twisted. I had to speak up. I had to make it clear that this wasn't acceptable, that I wasn't comfortable with this. But the words wouldn't come. They were stuck, thick as syrup in my throat. I scanned the room, hoping to find someone who could see what was wrong, someone who could understand. But the other men seemed completely oblivious. Or worse, they were all in on it. I set my drink down on. The table remained untouched as my hands trembled. The man who had kissed me gave a slow, knowing smile, his dark eyes flashing in the faint light. There was something unsettling about him, the way he carried himself with such self-assurance, as though he was enjoying some kind of game. But I wasn't part of it. I got up, the urge to move overwhelming me, desperate to do something that would restore some sense of control. I crossed the room and headed toward the narrow hallway leading to the kitchen. My breathing was shallow, my pulse pounding in my temples. I just needed a moment, a brief instant to clear my head and figure out what was going on. As I stepped into the kitchen, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, half expecting it to be my husband, but it was the man from the armchair, the one who had kissed me. He leaned casually against the doorframe, his arms folded across his chest, watching me. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a murmur. I nodded, though it felt like a lie. "Yeah, just need some fresh air." He moved closer, deliberately slow. "It's just a kiss, nothing to make a fuss about." The words twisted my stomach. There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl, something cold and calculated. I forced myself to meet his gaze, even though every instinct told me to look away, to escape. "I don't think that's appropriate," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. His smile grew, but it never reached his eyes. "You didn't seem to mind earlier." Before I could respond, he closed the gap between us, just enough that I could feel his presence, his breath brushing my skin. My heart raced, but my body remained frozen, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and confusion. I wanted to push him away, scream for my husband, or do something, anything, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't cooperate. And deep inside, I questioned whether my husband would even care. That thought hit me harder than anything. The painful realization that he had seen the kiss, had noticed how close his friend was standing now, and yet had done nothing to intervene. He hadn't even acknowledged it. Was this what he had wanted? Was this part of the plan? I took a shaky breath, stepping back just enough to break his stare. I needed to think, to understand what was happening. I couldn't confront him yet, not when I didn't even know what game we were playing. He continued staring at me for a moment longer, his gaze unwavering, before he turned and walked back into the living room without a word. I was left alone in the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. What was happening? How had I ended up here, in this house, surrounded by strangers, in a situation that made no sense? I remembered when my husband had suggested we come here. He had been so casual, so certain that I'd agree, and I had. I hadn't questioned it, hadn't pushed back. I had trusted him. But now I wasn't so sure. I pushed myself off the counter, wiping my damp palms on my jeans. I couldn't stay in the kitchen forever. I had to go back and face whatever this was. But as I stepped into the hallway, a nagging feeling lingered, that I was walking into something I wasn't prepared for. I returned to the living room, my heart still racing from the tension of the kitchen. The men were deep in conversation, laughing, while my husband sat on the couch with his usual laid-back smile. He glanced up at me, but there was no sign of concern in his eyes, no indication that he noticed the unease I was feeling. His calmness, his detachment, only made everything feel more unnerving than I cared to admit. I sat down quietly next to him, forcing a smile to match his. I didn't want to cause a scene, not when I wasn't sure what to say. The evening continued, and I did my best to keep the conversation light, avoiding eye contact with the man who had trapped me in the kitchen. Suddenly, my husband turned to me with a suggestion that felt entirely out of place, given the strangeness of the night. "How about we go to the water park tomorrow?" His voice was casual, as if it were the most natural idea in the world. "A water park?" I repeated, surprise clear in my voice. It was cold outside, hardly ideal weather for water slides and wave pools. And why would he suggest something so normal after everything that had just happened? "Yeah, I think it'd be fun. All of us," he said, motioning toward his three friends. "We haven't had a day out together in a while. It'll be good for us." I hesitated. The suggestion felt absurd after the tension of the evening. My mind was still reeling from everything that had happened, and now he wanted to act like nothing was wrong, as if we could just go to the water park and pretend the weirdness didn't exist. But part of me wanted to believe him, to accept the idea that everything was fine. Maybe this could be a way to reset, to restore some normalcy. "I don't know," I began, but before I could finish, he leaned in closer. "Come on, it'll be fun. I promise you'll feel better afterwards." His voice softened, and something about it made me second-guess my earlier thoughts. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was reading too much into it. I nodded slowly. "All right, the water park it is." The next day, we piled into the car, and I found myself wedged between my husband and one of his friends in the back seat. The drive to the water park was filled with lighthearted chatter, the kind you expect from old friends reminiscing about past adventures. After what felt like days of silence, the knot in my stomach started to loosen, and the tension from the night before seemed to fade with each mile. When we arrived, the air was brisk but not too cold, and the towering blue slides loomed before us like some strange monument to summer fun. It had been years since I'd been to a water park, and as we walked in, a wave of nostalgia hit me. The kind you get when you're reminded of simpler times when everything felt carefree and fun. I couldn't help but smile as we slipped into our swimsuits and made our way towards the lazy river. At first, the guys were just goofing around, laughing and splashing each other, and gradually I began to unwind. The sound of the water was soothing, almost as though it were washing away the tension I had been carrying. My husband floated next to me, his hand brushing mine now and then, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything had returned to normal. Just the two of us, enjoying the day as we once did. We spent hours hopping from slide to slide, laughing as we got drenched by towering waterfalls and zoomed down the chutes at speeds that felt impossible. I even let out a scream of pure exhilaration as I plunged down one of the highest slides. It was the kind of joy I hadn't allowed myself to feel in ages. To my surprise, I was genuinely having fun. After a while, we decided to take a break and grab some snacks. We found a shady spot to rest and catch our breath. As I looked around at the group, something changed. For the first time since meeting my husband's friends, I didn't feel like an outsider. I no longer felt like I was standing on the sidelines. One of the men, the one who had kissed me the night before, locked eyes with me. He was laughing with the others, and in the daylight, with everything so lighthearted and carefree, he almost seemed harmless. It's odd how much a shift in scenery can change everything, how the brightness of the day can mask the heaviness of the night before. My husband nudged me with his elbow. "Are you having fun?" he asked, his voice warm this time. I smiled genuinely. "Yeah, I really am." "See? Told you this would be good for us." He grinned, and for the first time in a long while, I actually believed him. As the afternoon passed, we made our way toward the wave pool, one of our last stops before wrapping up the day. The water was cold as we waded in, but the waves were gentle, swaying us back and forth in a soothing rhythm. I leaned back, letting the water carry me, my eyes closed, allowing the weight of the last few days to slip away. Maybe I had been overthinking everything. Perhaps last night hadn't been as off as I had imagined. Now, it made sense. My husband had suggested this outing so we could reconnect, to remind me that everything was still okay. And maybe, just maybe, we were okay too. By the time we left, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. My muscles were sore from all the fun we'd had, but it was a satisfying ache, the kind you get after a good workout. During the drive home, the car was filled with light conversation and the soft hum of the road beneath us. I rested my head against the cool glass of the window, allowing myself to drift into a peaceful haze. It felt like everything was okay, at least that's what I kept telling myself. But as soon as we stepped inside the house, that calm sense of peace vanished. The house felt colder, emptier, darker. It was as if the joy from earlier had given me a false sense of serenity. Now everything felt wrong again, as if I was back to square one. My husband was in the kitchen, searching through the fridge for a drink. The three guys had come back with us after the park, their voices still echoing through the living room as they recounted the events of the day. I stood by the counter, watching him as the fridge light cast strange shadows across his face. "Is everything all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me. There was a slight tremor in it that I couldn't hide. He turned to me, flashing that same smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes. "Yeah, everything's fine. Today was fun, huh?" I nodded, but the knot in my stomach was back. Yeah, it was. But the calm I felt earlier is gone, replaced by something else, something darker. I could feel it in the air, thick and oppressive, creeping back with each passing moment. The carefree mood of earlier seemed like a distant memory, and now, with everyone back in the house, the tension was even more noticeable. It was as though everything that had been hidden was bubbling up again. My husband, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere, reached across the counter and took my hand. His touch was warm, but it didn't ease the storm raging inside me. "How about we all relax for a bit? Watch something?" His voice was soft, but there was something about it that felt off to me. "Sure," I replied, though the last thing I wanted was to be in a room full of people. I just wanted to retreat to the bedroom and have some space. But instead, I followed him into the living room and sank down on the couch between him and one of his friends. The TV flickered on, casting a faint glow in the room, but I wasn't really paying attention. I kept sneaking glances at the men, noticing how their conversation had lowered in volume, how the tension in the room had shifted, becoming more charged. My husband was relaxed, leaning back on the couch, his arm draped casually around my shoulders. It was supposed to be comforting, but instead, it felt suffocating. The man sitting closest to me, the one who had kissed me the night before, moved closer. I could feel the heat radiating off him, even though he wasn't touching me. My pulse quickened. His presence felt more unsettling now than ever. I looked at my husband, waiting for him to say something, anything, to acknowledge what was happening, to see the unease on my face. But he didn't. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the screen, that faint, unbothered smile still lingering on his lips. Then, without warning, the man leaned in closer. His breath was warm against my ear. "You liked today, didn't you?" He whispered so quietly that I almost didn't hear it, but it still sent a cold shiver down my spine. I forced a smile, my chest tightening. "Yeah, it was fun." He grinned, but his gaze lingered on me, staying far too long, as if he were looking for something. I wasn't ready to give in. I couldn't bear to look at him anymore. Instead, I turned my attention to the TV, hoping that would be enough to make him stop. But then I felt it. A brief, intentional contact against my leg, his hand lingering there just a moment too long. Panic surged through me. I froze, unable to react. Before I could even process what had happened, I caught my husband's gaze. He saw it. He had to have seen it. But still, he did nothing. His face was unreadable, his posture relaxed as if nothing unusual was occurring. Every part of me screamed that something was wrong, but there was no reaction from him, no support, no intervention, just silence. I shifted slightly, increasing the space between myself and the man, but the sensation didn't fade. It only grew stronger, like something was about to break, something I couldn't control. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The air was thick, oppressive, and I struggled to breathe properly. I didn't understand exactly what was going on, but I knew I wasn't okay. I had to get out. "I think I'll go get some water," I muttered, standing up suddenly. No one stopped me as I walked into the kitchen, my mind spinning, my thoughts a whirlpool of confusion and fear. Once I reached the counter, I braced myself, pressing my palms flat against the cool surface. I took deep, shaky breaths, trying to calm myself. From the other room, I could hear their laughter, the easy conversation filling the house, but it all felt so distant. I couldn't concentrate on it. I kept replaying the look on my husband's face, the way he hadn't responded to any of it, the way he had let it all slide. Was this what he wanted? Had this been the plan all along? My fingers turned white as I gripped the counter. This wasn't right. None of this was right. But how could I stop it? I didn't know what to say or how to confront him, or them, without feeling like I was exaggerating. Maybe I had let it go on too long. Maybe I had allowed this to unfold without setting the boundaries that should have been there from the start. The sound of footsteps interrupted my thoughts. I looked up and saw my husband standing in the doorway. He gazed at me, his eyes soft but distant, as though he could sense my discomfort but didn't know how to address it. "You all right?" he asked quietly. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to confront him, explain the way the man had touched me, how I felt like I was losing control over everything. But when I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come. All I could manage was, "I'm fine." He moved closer to me, placing his hands gently on my shoulders. "We're just having a good time. You're overthinking it." His words were meant to reassure me, but they only made me feel smaller, more uncertain. I forced myself to nod. "Yeah, maybe." He smiled and kissed me on the forehead. "Come back to the living room when you're ready. You'll feel better." As he walked away, I stood there alone in the dimly lit kitchen, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. How had everything become so complicated? How had I allowed it all to slip so far out of my control? And as I watched his figure disappear down the hallway, one thing became clear. I wasn't prepared for whatever was coming next. That night, sleep evaded me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of my thoughts crushing me. My husband was beside me, breathing deeply and steadily, already lost in sleep. I turned onto my side, away from him. But no matter how hard I tried to push everything out of my mind, it kept returning. The way he watched me, the way his friend had touched me, and worst of all, the fact that I hadn't said a word. What was happening to us? The next morning, everything felt strangely quiet. The faint murmur of voices drifted from the living room, but I stayed in bed, dreading what the day might bring. My husband eventually got up, leaving me alone in the pale light of the bedroom. I stared at the wall, my mind racing through the events of the past few days. I had let it go on for too long, and now it felt like I was trapped in a situation I couldn't control. I didn't even know how to confront him anymore. I dragged myself out of bed and headed to the kitchen. It was empty, but I could hear my husband and his friends outside, their voices drifting in through the open window. I leaned against the counter, trying to catch fragments of their conversation. It was the same as always, light, casual, as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Not for them, but for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something I wasn't ready for. It wasn't just the subtle touches or the way they looked at me. It was the way my husband acted, as if everything was fine, as if he hadn't noticed the shift in our relationship. Or maybe he had noticed and just didn't care. The thought tightened my chest as the day dragged on. The tension kept building. The men remained outside, laughing and joking, while I stayed in the kitchen, feeling more alone than ever. My mind replayed everything the way my husband had suggested, spending the day with his friends, how he observed me as if waiting for something. What was he waiting for? I couldn't bear it any longer. I needed answers. I had to confront him. But as I approached the patio door, my legs felt as if they were weighed down, as though they were made of lead. I stood there, watching him through the glass, laughing with his friends. They appeared so at ease, so comfortable. I didn't fit in that scene, but I couldn't just remain there. I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. With a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped outside. The laughter faded as they saw me. My husband turned, offering the same familiar smile. "Is everything all right?" he asked, but I could tell from his eyes that he already knew the response. I stared at him. my heart pounding in my chest. The words were there, stuck in my throat, but I couldn't get them out. The weight of it all, the uncertainty, the fear, the betrayal, was overwhelming. I stood frozen on the patio, the cool breeze against my skin, while his question hovered between us like a shadow. Is everything all right? His smile was still there, but his eyes didn't seem to notice the cracks I could feel forming beneath the surface. Or perhaps he saw them and simply didn't care. I tried to speak, but no words came. The silence stretched on, thick with the unspoken tensions that had been building for days. His friends, who had been laughing, now fell silent, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. I knew I had to say something, to make him understand that none of this was acceptable, that everything had changed. But all I could hear were the echoes of the past few days. The odd touches, the lingering stares, the moments that felt off but went unspoken, and always his silence. I don't know who you are anymore, I whispered, my voice barely audible, my chest tightening as I tried to keep it together. He stood there, waiting for me to say more, but his smile faded, replaced by a look of concern, one that felt too late, too rehearsed. What is it? He asked, stepping closer, but I instinctively took a step back. My thoughts were racing. I don't know what this is, what you've turned us into. His eyes widened, confusion flickering across his face, but he didn't answer immediately. The silence grew thick, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I waited for him to speak, to say anything that would make sense of this, explain him. But nothing came. His friends exchanged anxious glances, the tension in the air palpable. Their eyes shifted toward me, but I couldn't focus on them. All I could see was him, the man I thought I knew, who now felt like a stranger standing before me. What are you talking about? He finally asked, his voice low, too controlled. I gestured around us, my hands trembling, desperate to make him understand. I'm talking about this. My voice cracked. All of this. The way you've been watching me, the way you've allowed them. I stopped, unable to finish the words stuck in my throat, too heavy to express. He stared at me, his expression unreadable, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, recognition, maybe even regret. But it disappeared as quickly as it came. His mask slid back into place, and the calm, distant demeanor I had come to dread returned. You're overreacting, he said softly, but with such finality that it felt like he was speaking to a child who didn't understand the rules. And maybe I didn't. Maybe that was the issue. I shook my head, tears threatening to spill. No, I'm not. You've changed. We've changed. I don't feel safe anymore. Not with you, not here. The words hung between us, heavy and final, but he didn't move. He didn't react. He simply stared at me as if I were a stranger. And maybe I was. Maybe we both were. The silence stretched on, suffocating. His friends watched, frozen, but I couldn't even acknowledge them anymore. It was just him, just us, standing on the precipice of something I couldn't define, something I couldn't control. And then, in the midst of the quiet, he said it, the words that shattered everything between us. I thought this was what you wanted. I froze. The weight of his words hit me like a tidal wave. What I wanted. No, he couldn't possibly believe that. This couldn't be what I wanted. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw the truth. He actually believed it. He had convinced himself that all of this, everything, was part of some unspoken agreement, some twisted fantasy that I was supposed to play along with. And in that moment, I realized something. He didn't know me at all. The person he thought he was with, the one he thought he could shape and control, that wasn't me. Not anymore. Maybe it never had been. I'm leaving, I said, my voice steady and cutting through the air. It was a declaration, the words I had been avoiding for so long. I can't stay here. Not with you. For the first time, I saw his expression change. The facade cracked slightly, and something flickered. Panic, regret. But it was too late. You don't mean that, he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. I turned away and walked into the house, my legs shaky but firm. I didn't stop to grab my things. I didn't look back. The decision settled on me like a weight, but it felt right. I reached the front door, my hand hovering over the handle, and for a moment I hesitated. The air outside was cold, sharp against my skin. The sky above was dark, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold air, feeling the chill seep into my bones. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know where I was going or what I would do, But as I walked down the empty street, the echo of my footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness, I realized something. For the first time in so long, I felt free. And that terrified me more than anything.